Okay, everyone, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to the Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth Ideas Research Workshop. This is our first workshop for the spring semester, so we're excited to get going. We've got a lot of great speakers this semester. So for those of you who haven't attended any of our workshops before, just a little background. The Ideas Research Workshop invites leading scholars from all over the world to present research and engage in discussion with the NDSU community on topics relevant to individual and societal flourishing. Our seminars focus on issues related to institutions, trade, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Before introducing today's speaker, let me just describe a little bit how things are going to work. If you're attending remotely, during the presentation, you will find a link to a Google Doc in the Zoom chat feature. So you can click on that link, and then that allows you can introduce yourself in the document if you want. And critically, that is where you will be able to type questions that I will collect for the end of the presentation and then present them to Marian. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can before we have to shut down at 3:30. I'm personally really excited about today's presentation. Right now, we're in the middle of a deadly pandemic that has not only taken many lives, but it's also caused a great deal of social, psychological, and economic harm. There is also currently a great deal of political division in our society. All of this makes it easy to be driven by pessimism and cynicism, and to forget or perhaps ignore all the ways life is getting better around the world. Our speaker today, Marian Tupy, is going to help us see the bigger picture. Marian Tupy is the editor of humanprogress.org, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity at the Cato Institute, and co-author of the Simon Project. He specializes in globalization and global well-being and politics and economics of Europe and Southern Africa. His articles have been published in the Financial Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Newsweek, and many, many other outlets. He's appeared on BBC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, Fox Business, and lots of other channels. He received his PhD in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in Great Britain, and he is also the co-author of the recent book, 10 Global Trends That Every Smart Person Needs to Know, and many other trends you will find interesting. Without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce Marian Tupy.
Thank you very much, Clay. Much appreciated. Thanks to everybody who is watching this presentation. I'm going to jump right into it because I think the most interesting part of any conversation is really the Q&A. So hopefully I can share my screen. Yes, indeed I can. And Clay, if you can just tell me if you can see the full screen, can you? Yeah, just give me a thumbs up. Okay, brilliant. Okay. So most things are getting better, yet people remain pessimistic. That's the title of my presentation. And before we talk about human progress, we need to ask ourselves, what is progress? And the Oxford English Dictionary says that progress is an advancement to a higher or further stage development, usually to a better state or condition, improvement applied especially to manifestations of social and economic change or reform. So then the question becomes really, is there any evidence for progress? So the first evidence for progress I want to start with is life expectancy. And we are going to take this all the way back to 10,000 BC, which is the beginning of the agricultural revolution. We stop being hunter-gatherers and we become sedentary species, agriculturalists, which is the story of the last 12,000 years. And as you can see, life expectancy pretty much flatlined between the start of the agricultural revolution, through the introduction of the first cities, through the birth of Jesus or Caesar Augustus. We have a little bit of an uptick during the Enlightenment, which is the time of the scientific revolution. The world is becoming wealthier, and we are able to afford better sanitations and things like that. But it's really only in the 19th century and the 20th century that life expectancy increases from about 25 years to roughly 72 years globally today. And about 78, 79 years in developed countries. And then you have outliers like, for example, Japan, where life expectancy is all the way up to 82 or 83 years. So this is really a detailed view of the previous chart. And as you can see, the Western world, which is to say Western Europe and and North America, enter the 19th century already ahead of the rest of the world. And then during the Industrial Revolution, when the West becomes really rich and the rest of the world is still stuck in an agricultural or hunter-gathering lifestyles, a huge gap emerges between the two, but that begins to narrow. So this is really the life expectancy gap over the last 60 years or so. And as you can see, the life expectancy gap between developed and developing countries was 23 years in 1960, but that has fallen to 8 years by 2017. So the people in poor countries, as they are becoming richer, as they are assuming more of the knowledge associated with longer life expectancy, better medical technology, better sanitation, better hygiene, the life expectancy gap has fallen. This is another chart which shows a child mortality under the age of 5. And I only have one country that goes back to the 18th century, and that's Sweden. And the reason why I have it is because, well, I have the data for it. And as you can see, there were times in the 18th century when up to half, I repeat, half of babies under the age of 5 could be expected to die in a country that was then poor, but now is, of course, the very definition of a successful Western liberal democracy. Once you move into the 20th century, you can see that throughout the world, other regions have started to catch up the infant mortality rate and child mortality rate in those countries, and those regions have started to fall. And the important thing is to notice the angle of the decline. Massive decline, very sharp angle downwards in South Asia in the second half of the 20th century. What happens there is that obviously, as China specifically embraces economic reforms, they have higher rates of economic growth, and they have had some of the greatest gains in terms of overcoming child mortality, infant mortality, and so forth. But throughout the world, you have this trend repeating itself, and we are all slowly but surely getting towards zero or thereabouts. So today in sub-Saharan Africa, child mortality is roughly where it was in Sweden in 1930, so about 90 years ago. And again, let's look at the gap. The gap in 1969 was 135 dead babies between developing countries and developed countries, and that has now shrunk to 33. Which I think is a fantastic development. Obviously, we want to see those two lines get as close to zero as possible. This gives you a sense of GDP per capita, again, going back 12,000 years. And as you can see, once again, this is what we call the hockey stick of human prosperity. And as you can see, for thousands of years, you couldn't really see much of an improvement in income globally. In fact, there was none. Prior to 1750, GDP per capita rose by about 0.01%, which means that in order to double your income, it took 6,000 years. So that gives you a sense of how incredibly poorly humanity has lived. In year one, according to the Medicine Project, GDP per capita per person per day was about $2. By the time that Jefferson becomes president in 1800, it rose to $2.80 per person per dollar. We are talking about globally now. I put Jefferson there for sort of, to sort of get us oriented, but this is global GDP per capita per person. And in the 1800 years, which separated the notional birth of Christ and Jefferson presidency, it increased by 80 cents, right? Today, GDP per capita, or in 2016, GDP per capita globally per day was $40. These are all adjusted for inflation, which means that in the last 2,000 years, it's a jump from $2 to $40. In the last 200 years, it's a jump from $280 to $40. And if the current growth rate continues, in other words, if over the next 80 years we are able to replicate the growth rate that we have had over the last 100 years, then GDP per capita per person will be $166 per person per day at the end of this century. GDP per capita in the United States is $140 today, which means that adjusted for inflation, global average, people will be $20 better off than Americans are today, if we can maintain the current rate of growth. This shows you the gap between developing and developed countries. And as you can see, that has actually grown in absolute terms from about $9,000 to about $33,000. So just looking at this picture, you would get a sense that the West is growing at a much faster pace, the rich countries, and they are leaving the poor countries behind. But this picture is misleading because when you look at the actual percentage of Western incomes which are earned by people in poor countries, that has increased. So even though nominally there seems to be we are going further apart, once you turn it into percentages, what you find that between 1952 and 2019, the poor country share of rich countries' income has doubled from 16 to 29%. Or let me put it slightly differently. In 1952, people in poor countries made 16% of the income of people in rich countries. Today, they are making 30% of income in rich countries. Now, of course, as a result of the increase in wealth, absolute poverty has been in decline, especially since the beginning of the new millennium. So those of you who have been born around the year 2000, you have overseen the greatest reduction in human poverty ever experienced on planet Earth. At the beginning of the 19th century, around 1820 or so, roughly 9 out of 10 people in the world lived in absolute poverty, which is to say $2 per person per day. If you go much below $2 per person per day, you're probably starving to death. So the $2 per person per day, that's the sustenance level or subsistence level. That's the cutoff. Anything below that, far beyond that, below that, and you're probably dying of starvation. So at the beginning of the 19th century, 9 out of 10 people in the world lived on the edge, lived on that level of subsistence. By the new millennium, the number of people living in, or rather the share of the population living in absolute poverty had fallen to 29%. And by 2020, by last year, it has fallen to 7.6%. So once again, those of you who are 20-year-old, you saw the reduction of absolute poverty from 29% of global population to 7.6. Again, this is dollars. This is absolute poverty is measured in $2 per person per day, adjusted for inflation. So no tricks here. If you look at this chart from the perspective of $3 per person per day or $5 per person per day, you can still see the same effect. So it doesn't matter where you draw the line, people are still growing richer. So absolute poverty, it is my contention, is no longer a global problem. It is really an African problem. Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa to be precise, is denoted on this chart by the yellow space. And if you look at it, it seems to be flatlining between 2020 and the projected 2030. But that's because the population in sub-Saharan Africa is still growing, whereas populations in other parts of the world are either stagnating or even shrinking. The population in sub-Saharan Africa is still growing. So over the next 10 years, we expect the population of sub-Saharan Africa to increase by about 300 million. But the share of the people will remain the same in poverty, which really means that, which really means that even though the total number of people in sub-Saharan Africa will remain, the same number of people in sub-Saharan Africa will remain in poverty, the share will decline because you have to adjust for population growth. We are also working less. Between 1950 and 2017, the total numbers of hours worked per worker in the United States declined by 11%. In high-income countries, it has declined by 21%. So we are earning more money, but we are doing it more productively. So we are working less. Now, the reason why I put South Korea there is because South Korea exemplifies the process of how working hours increase and then decrease. What tends to happen in very poor agricultural societies that people actually don't work that many hours, but once they start industrializing and once they start earning more money per hour of labor, they start working more and more because that's a snowballing effect. They can see that by working more, they can get more money. But at some point, they work so much and earn so much money that they start prioritizing other things, such as leisure and spending time with their families, traveling around the world, and so forth. And at that point, the working time begins to decline. And in South Korea was an agricultural society back in 1950. Everybody was incredibly poor. South Korea was poorer than Ghana, okay? But then in the 1970s and 1980s, they started working a lot, they started producing a lot, they liberalized, they embraced the free market, they entered the global trading system, and they started working more, they started earning money, and at some point they decided individually, okay, we are working perhaps too long, maybe we can prioritize other things. And ever since then, South Korean hours of work started to decline, and they are on a downward trend. This is a little bit of a more difficult chart to explain, but bear with me. As you know, we have a lot of discussion in the United States about cost of living and standards of living. And there's no question that in some aspects, America has become a more expensive place to live, especially when it comes to schooling, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to childcare. As an aside, all of these areas are very heavily government regulated and subsidized, but we don't need to go into that. In places where the market is allowed to function, where competition is allowed to drive down prices, we have seen an extraordinary decline in prices and increase in standard of living. And you can see that this is a chart of appliances. I have other charts pertaining to other aspects of American standard of living, but this is appliances. And what this shows you is how many more items, same items, you can purchase for the same amount of labor. So let's look at color TV. If in 1979, you had to work 10 hours to buy a color TV, 25-inch color TV, by 2019, you could buy 15 TVs for the same amount of time, okay? Same with things like, I don't know, a coffee maker. You can get 3 times as many coffee makers for the same amount of labor today as you would have in 1979. You can get 2.5 washers, you can get 2.3 electric dryers, and so on and so forth. So in some aspects, America has become a much cheaper place to live. I don't want to overemphasize this. There has been some backsliding, again, in some areas. We can talk about that in Q&A. Years of schooling. We are obviously spending much more time at school, learning globally. The amount of time that a child could expect to spend in some form of formal schooling setting in the late 1800s was about 0.5 years in their entire lifetime. Again, globally, at the end of 19th century, it was about 0.5 years in their entire lifetimes. Today, globally, it is somewhere around 8.5 hours. Obviously, in rich countries, we spend much more time in educating ourselves than in poor countries. But still, globally, we have seen tremendous amount of increase in the number of years that we spend in education, which explains partly why we are much more productive, why we are able to earn more money in less time. Literacy rate. Literacy rate today in sub-Saharan Africa is about 66%, which is roughly where France was in 1870. Globally, we are at around, I think, at around 80%. There are obviously some parts of the world where people will never be literate because they are so old that they are no longer, intending to become literate. But the bottom line is that literacy rate right now in the world is about 80%. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest place in the world, it is around 66%. Homicide rates. So at the time of, who is this? This is Leonardo da Vinci. At the time of Leonardo da Vinci, no, this is actually Michelangelo. When Michelangelo was alive in Italy, working in Florence, 73 out of 100,000 Italians could expect it to be murdered in their lifetimes. Today in Europe, murder rates are down to less than 1 person per 100,000. The picture is not so rosy in the United States. In the Northeast, we have murder rates very similar to those in Western Europe. But in the West and in the South, they are substantially higher to about 3 or 4 persons per 100,000. There are some places in the world like Honduras, South Africa, where murder rates are still between 66 and 33. But certainly in the Western world, we have seen a tremendous decline in murder rates. Global trades in armed conflicts. So this will be maybe a bit of a surprise to a lot of people who think that we live in a violent world. But in reality, interstate wars have basically disappeared. Even when countries do go to war against one another, like Armenia against Azerbaijan for a couple of months last year, even when Russia invades Eastern Ukraine. They don't declare war on each other. So interstate wars, in a sense of two countries declaring war on each other and then going to war, have actually more or less disappeared. I don't think that any country has declared a war on another since the United States declared war on North Korea, or vice versa. But we just don't do that sort of thing. Instead, what's happening is that we have a lot more social conflict or civil wars. But again, keep it in perspective. We have many fewer civil wars than we had in the 70s and the 80s. Basically, with the fall of communism, we have seen a massive drop-off in international conflicts, but also in civil wars. Yes, civil wars still go on. They will go on for a long time to come. But we have fewer of them in spite of the recent uptick than we have had in the 70s and the 80s. And the reason why the yellow line and the blue line are joined together is because basically wars, total number of wars are basically all civil wars. That's the reason why they are mushed together. Battle deaths per conflict. These are conflicts of 1,000, I think 1,000 casualties, but as you can see, there has been a prodigious decline in the lethality of wars in terms of how many lives wars take. There has been a decline, except of course for civil wars, which have increased in deadliness a little bit over the last decade. Not only are we safer from one another, we are also safer from the acts of God, strange as this sounds. The red line tells you non-climate related deaths. These are deaths from earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes. Those are almost impossible to predict, if at all. And so you wouldn't expect necessarily to see fewer deaths. However, climate related deaths from floods, droughts, storms, wildfires, and extreme temperatures have declined by 99% over the last 100 years. There are some reasons for that. I mean, we are richer, we build sturdier dwellings. We are better at flood protection. 1/3 of Holland is underwater, essentially under the water level, yet they managed to run one of the most prosperous societies. Bottom line is, when we have identified an environmental problem, we adapt both technologically and also lifestyle-wise in order to reduce climate-related deaths. We can talk about it in the context of global warming and climate change later. But obviously, this is a very important set of data because it puts into perspective the sort of, scary, a lot of the scary rhetoric that you hear about climate change. Global trends in governance. These are total number of countries who are either democracies or autocracies. Yet again, look what happened after the fall of communism. Basically, autocracies have collapsed, democracies have risen. Of course, in recent years, we had a bit of a backsliding, but still, so today, the number of democracies is certainly not at its highest. This particular chart ends in 2018, and ever since then, and even since then, there have been a couple of fall-offs. But the bottom line is, democracy is certainly not in a full-fledged retreat. We are starting from very high. Just look at where democracy was in 1800s. I mean, that was basically the United States, and that's it. And even the United States was not a perfect democracy. Then we had a bit of an uptick at the start of the 20th century. Then we had a decline during the 1930s and the rise of fascism and communism. But we are in a decent place. Anocracies, which is the gray line, are countries which exhibit both democratic and autocratic features. And we have seen an uptick there since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So all of that means that there are many more people in the world. Better, we live longer, we make more money, and there are many more people in the world than there used to be. I mean, at the time of Christ or Augustus, there were only 300 million people in the world. Today, it's almost 8 billion people. And yet, interestingly enough, food supply continues to increase. So today, food supply in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the poorest continent in the world, poorest region in the world, calorie intake is roughly where it was in Portugal in the early 1960s, which I think is absolutely remarkable. In fact, there are only 2 countries in the world, Madagascar and one more, which I can't remember, where people's access to calories is less than 2,000 per day, which is what WHO and FAO and others recommend. So, and obviously the world average is much higher than 2,000 calories per person per day. And perhaps most interestingly, from the perspective of the book that I'm writing, and hopefully I will have out later this year, resources are falling in price. So normally, what people believe is that when you have a massive increase in population, you are going to have more pressure on resources and they will become more expensive. But that's not what we found. The time price of commodities has actually fallen by 72% on average between 1980 and 2018. And what I mean by time price is the amount of time that people have to work in order to afford to buy something. So if you look at sugar, for example, what this means is that the amount of time that you had to work as a global citizen, we are thinking about an average person living somewhere in Malaysia, the amount of time that you had to work in order to buy a kilo or a pound of sugar declined by 86%. Coffee, 85%, pork, 85%, cocoa, 83%, salmon, 81%. I can explain the reason why I like to transform everything into time prices a little bit later, but basically when I look at prices, the ones I like is time price, how much you have to work in order to afford something, because that accounts for the fact that people work less, fewer hours. It accounts for increases in salary and things like that. But we can get to that a little bit later. Okay, COVID. So it was a bloody catastrophe. It was a horrible year. But again, I would like everybody to keep in perspective the fact that until relatively recently, we, of course, suffered from pathogens since the dawn of time. And for thousands of years, we were dying from diseases. We didn't know what they were. We couldn't name them. We couldn't identify them. We didn't know what to do about them. You know, we have first evidence of polio and smallpox going back all the way to ancient Egyptian engravings 3,500 years ago. And, you know, smallpox was only eliminated in 1980. And even Ebola, which began in Africa in the 1970s, took about 43 years before we had a vaccine. With COVID, we had identified a problem, we have analyzed the problem, we have developed a cure, and we started vaccination within 1 year. So, you know, don't be too harsh on our species. We are going to be facing pathogens always, because there are two levels of evolution going on here. Human beings evolve, but our pathogens continue to evolve along with us, and at a much faster rate, because we are their big chunks of meat. We are their lunch, we are their dinner, we are their breakfast. They need us to replicate. And forever and ever, there will always be this constant battle between pathogens and human beings. And there is going to be more pathogens in the future, but the only better place, the only better time to be alive than today is tomorrow, because our technology is going to get better. The times of producing a vaccine are going to become shorter, and hopefully next time the crisis will be even lower or smaller than it is today. Also, don't forget that after the horrible year that we have had, the American economy is going to shrink by 3.5%. Now, this is the biggest decline since 1946. But in the broader scope of things, if your income falls by 3.5%, nationally and also individually, it's not the end of the world. We are going to make up for it in a couple of years. You know, the human pain, of course, cannot be washed away, but the economic damage hopefully will be overcome in a couple of years. How am I doing on time? Okay. So the planet has more people who are freer, who live longer, who are better educated, consume more food, enjoy higher incomes, work less, fight less, and have access to more abundant resources. Yet pessimism is everywhere. This is one of my favorite quotes from Matt Ridley from a book called The Rational Optimist. Matt is now in his 60s, and he wrote this 10 years ago. The bookshops are groaning under ziggurats of pessimism. The airwaves are crammed with doom. In my own adult lifetime, I have listened to the implacable predictions of growing poverty, coming famines, expanding deserts, imminent plagues, impending water wars, inevitable oil exhaustion, mineral shortages, falling sperm counts, thinning ozone, acidifying rain, nuclear winters, mad cow epidemics, Y2K computer bugs, killer bees, sex change fish, global warming, ocean acidification, and even asteroid impacts that would presently bring this happy interlude to a terrible end. I cannot recall a time when one or other of these scares was not solemnly espoused by sober, distinguished, and serious elites, and hysterically echoed by the media. The fashionable reason for optimism has changed, but pessimism was constant. In the 1960s, the population explosion and global famine were top of the charts. In the 1970s, the exhaustion of resources. In the 1980s, acid rain. In the 1990s, pandemics. In the 2000s, global warming. One by one of these scares has come and left. Well, you wouldn't know it from our public officials. Here is AOC asking a legitimate question: is it still okay to have children in the face of climate change? Here is Greta: you have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. Here is Bimara saying we should all die and stay dead for the benefit of the planet. We have Bill Nye, the science guy: the planet is on effing fire. And of course, here is a European scientist, nihilists, suggesting that people should start eating one another. So I ask with the British historian Thomas Babington Macaulay, On what principle is it that with nothing but improvement behind us, we are to expect nothing but deterioration before us? And I would suggest that there are some very important reasons for pessimism. So even let's call these the negativity biases which are ingrained in our brain. One is human hardware, the way that the brain has developed. So this is one of my favorite charts because it shows you how the human brain reacts to the presence of danger. Let's say that you're walking through a forest and suddenly you see let's say that it's just a piece of, let's say it's a branch of a tree that looks like a snake. The information will pass through your eyes to your visual thalamus and then straight to the amygdala, which is the part of our brain which is responsible for fear, rage, that sort of thing. Now, amygdala is directly tied to your nervous system. So when you see something that may look like a snake, you are going to jump away because your eyes through the visual thalamus and then amygdala are tied to your visual system, to your nervous system. Your first impression will be to jump back. But at the same time, while the information is passed to amygdala, it is also passed through the visual cortex, which is where the memory files are. And this is where the eye starts defining or redefining what's on the ground and deciding whether in fact it is a snake or just a branch of a tree. And if it is a snake, whether it's likely to be poisonous or not. But the point is that by the time that you have processed the information and decided whether in fact what you are seeing on the ground is dangerous or not, you have already taken the physical action of jumping away and protecting yourself. And this is just a very long way of saying that the human brain, especially the amygdala, have evolved to be constantly on the lookout for something to fear. And this may play a part in the reason why we are more attuned as a species to negative news and negative information than a positive one. But let me explore that a little bit in more depth. Because when you look at human software, again, you see these negativity biases. One of them is availability heuristic. And what that really means is that we tend to evaluate the likelihood of something terrible happening by the ease with which we can pull some memory out of the memory folder. And some memories are more traumatic than others. So for example, a plane flying into a skyscraper is a very traumatic thing, whereas slipping on a bathroom floor and on a wet bathroom floor and killing yourself that way, you don't have any memory of that because you've never seen anything like that. It's not something that you can pull out of your memory file. And consequently, we tend to overestimate the likelihood of a terrorist attack than falling on a wet bathroom floor and killing ourselves that way, even though many more Americans die in the second way rather than the first. So the availability heuristic, the traumatic memories, which may relate to very unlikely events, have a much more of a purchase on our memory than more mundane but more dangerous things that we don't remember visually or we have never really seen, and so forth. Relative versus absolute, we tend to, if good things happen to us, we tend to focus on relative rather than absolute improvements, which is to say, very often when you remind people that global poverty has declined or something like that, they will point out to increasing inequality rather than absolute improvement in human conditions. So no matter how much you tell people that people throughout the world are much richer than what they were 50 or 100 years ago, they will point to the relative inequalities or relative differences between people and focus on that, which of course contributes to negative biases. Bad is stronger than good. This is, again, a very important insight from the field of psychology, which shows that people fear losses much more than they look forward to gains. We are much more attuned to criticism than to praise. Next time you have an interview with your boss, he can spend 55 minutes telling you what a great job you did, but when you walk out, you will focus on that 5% of the time or the 5 minutes when he was criticizing you, And that will be something that will stick in your memory much more than the praise. Widening definition of bad. This is a very interesting insight from some Harvard psychologists who found that basically when we tackle a problem, that new state where the problem has been eliminated becomes the new floor, and we start judging problems relative to the new floor rather than what the floor was before you tackled the last problem. So to be politically incorrect and to take a very sensitive issue would be microaggressions and the insistence on parts of the political spectrum that racial problems in America are as bad as they've ever been. There aren't, we haven't seen much progress, etc. This is plainly nonsensical in a sense that we have overcome slavery, discrimination, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, even racial jokes are no longer considered to be appropriate. But all of those accomplishments have now become the new floor, and the problems or apparent problems or seeming problems that some people perceive, such as microaggressions, have now become the big issue. So there's a widening definition of bad. That's I guess what I'm saying. Reminiscence bump. As we grow older, we start pulling more and more, or rather remembering more and more things from our youth, when things were simpler, when we were healthier, when we could do 4 hours of sports every day and still be able to get up in the morning and ask for more, and our bodies weren't falling apart and all of these things. So, you know, we get a sense as we grow older that the childhood was much rosier than it really was. Different timelines between good and bad things happening. You know, to build a house takes years, to get a degree takes years, to defeat absolute poverty takes centuries, but to experience something horrible like a plane flying into a skyscraper, or alternatively to experience something horrible as a COVID pandemic, takes a very short time. And so good things happen on a much longer timeline than bad things happen. So that's another problem. Pessimism reduces expectations. This is something which I found when I was reading a quote from Stephen Hawking's. Somebody was asking him, why is he so cheerful? And he says, well, in 1961, I was diagnosed with a deadly disease, which gave me a year to live. I had, you know, so ever since then, every day was a blessing. So that's another thing that may be happening in our minds. And turning pointitis is just a very sort of colloquial name for a very interesting thing that happens in a human mind, which is that we always think that we are the special generation. Yes, every other generation has overcome its problems. Yes, every other generation was able to move humanity forward, develop new ways of, new technological ways, new maybe new ways of transport, or maybe new medicines and things like that. But we are different. We are so special that this broad outline of human progress doesn't apply to us. It will end with us. We are on the precipice, the end of times, and everything is going to hell. So that may be sort of darkening our prospects a little bit. And then there's the environment, the nature of the news. News is about things that happen, not about things that don't happen. If you don't have a civil war going on in Fargo, it's not going to make the news. But if you do have a civil war in Fargo, it will be on the news everywhere in the world. So that's just the nature of the news. It's about things that happen. And of course, the more dramatic it is, the better. Bad news sells. If it bleeds, it leads. Social media, I think that probably has a role to play, partly because it makes bad things more intimate and more immediate. You know, if 200 years ago, if there was an earthquake or a tsunami on the other side of the world, you would never hear about it. It just wasn't on your mind. Whereas now you can see tsunami destroying entire Japanese villages in real time on your phone. It makes you more vulnerable. And that's another problem, I think, with negativity. So what can you do? Well, one of the things that you can do is to remember that you are suffering from all of these negativity biases. Bad things are happening for sure, but try to put them in a perspective. Try to ask yourself, well, maybe I'm overreacting. What's the long-term trends? What is the current crisis compared to another? What other negativity biases I may be experiencing? And personally, what I find very helpful is to change my perspective whether I'm going into depression over COVID or the state of, or something like that. I think about how much worse things could be if we didn't have modern medicine and things like that. So I actually think, and Clay will perhaps disagree or perhaps want to opine, but I do think that human beings can affect their levels of happiness unless they are clinically depressed by actually changing their perspective and comparing themselves downwards or toward more unfortunate people than upwards, toward people who are more beautiful, who are more intelligent, who are faster, who are better at sports and things like that. So I think that we are in charge of our happiness, at least to some degree. Another thing that you can do is to buy this incredibly important book. my first work that came out in August 2020. I'm proud to say that it did very well on Amazon. We are now in the fourth printing. We designed it as a coffee table book, so it lies on your coffee table, and whenever people come over, whilst you're fixing drinks or something like that, they can look it over, and maybe it will spark a conversation. Please follow us on social media, and please visit Human Progress. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thanks, Marian. That was great. Since you called me out in person, I guess I'll respond to that before turning to the questions. I agree with you, actually. I think that one of the challenges we have, in our time, and I actually see this a lot in academia, is the promotion of the view that people don't really have a lot of control over their happiness. And I think you nailed it on the head. Short of, clearly there are people that have very serious brain disease and, suffer from, severe mental illness, but most people don't. And I think that you're right that most people have it in their, in their ability to do these types of mindful reflection types of tasks. And maybe even just having your book out on the coffee table is not a bad idea. I guess as like you need environmental cues to be reminded that, to do what like my mom or grandma, what it taught us is like the perspective take, like to count your blessings is another, another way it was framed. So I actually agree with you.
Yeah, my first book is dedicated to my grandmother who died about 10 years ago, and she lived through Nazi occupation and then communist occupation. So her perspective on life was slightly different from, a stupid teenager. She would make me finish my food and be very careful with money and things like that. Why? Because she remembered time when she had neither. So, it's very good to have grandmothers.
Yeah, agreed. So I'll first ask John if he's got any questions from the audience before turning to the online questions.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll start with one. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say that this reminds me of a satirical article that I saw on a satirical newspaper site, and it said, confirmed 2020, the worst year ever, as long as you've never lived at any other point in history. So anyway, so I think I love this. I think this is really a great presentation. It's good for all of us to be aware of these things. I'd like to ask you, are there things like ensuring economic freedom or free trade, or things that would make it more likely that we can continue the rate of growth that we've experienced, recently over the next 80 years, as you say, to, have the, the much higher standard of living in the future, so that we can continue the progress that's been made?
There's no doubt that the original push towards greater standards of living had to do with the expansion of free trade. And even for countries which are only entering the global economy now, such as sub-Saharan Africa, free trade and being able to import, export without barriers to free trade is incredibly important. We should keep it. We'll probably have to change it around the edges a little bit. We are probably going to be less reliant on drug manufacturing on the opposite side of the world. That's fine. COVID has reminded us that certain things, are best made at home. But this shouldn't be misunderstood as a call for protectionism. It just means that that we need to plan for contingencies, such as having constant access to PPE and having vaccination facilities and things like that. So in that sense, the free trade purists have to accept that there will be certain things that countries will insist on making at home, but that doesn't mean that you need to make everything at home. That doesn't mean that you should eschew free trade because we had this pandemic. But more important is that as we are moving into the world where tariffs on goods have become smaller, and where most of the world is globalized and participating in the global economy, the new push for economic growth will not come from adding billions of more people into the productive sector. They are already there. 1.4 billion people in China are already producing. That kind of numbers of people cannot be replicated. In fact, population growth is going to decline. But future growth is going to come from innovation. So you can distinguish between two types of growth: the Smithian growth, Adam Smith and his pin factory, and that's basically the growth that we have experienced between, say, 1750 and maybe like 1950. But now we are moving into the world of Schumpeterian growth, which is much more about innovation, much more reliant not on having more and more people making widgets, but more and more people thinking about new cancer drugs and new COVID vaccines and new sources of energy. Obviously, the big one is applying human ingenuity to figuring out a way to power the world without CO2, so maybe fusion reactors and things like that. So I would say, yes, Smithian growth is good. We should keep it. But Schumpeterian growth, the one that really looks at innovation, is even more important and will become more important in the future.
Great, thank you.
Okay, now I've got some questions in the Google document here for you, Marian. So the first question is, how do quality of life years factor into your message? People are living longer, but maybe sicker for the final years of their life.
Yes, that is a concern. That is a concern. That is not to say that all of the gains in life expectancy are commensurate with life spending in an ICU. I mean, in 1900, let's not forget, life expectancy in the richest countries was 50 years. In the United States, it was 47 years. So let's say that serious infirmity comes in on average in late 70s, and by the age of 85, a lot of people start declining, and their quality of life is really bad. At least from my experience, having seen what happens to people I know, it tends to happen in the 80s. But so what? I mean, you still had decent and enjoyable years between the 47, 100 years ago, to maybe 77. So it's not like one-on-one trade-off. And of course, we have to, then there are extraordinary developments in senescence research. Of course, as a rich society, we can put serious money and serious brain power behind making those last years as enjoyable as possible. new drugs and new discoveries are coming on. Well, I mean, maybe not new drugs, but new discoveries about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are being made every year. We are able to the senescence research is really taking off and has been taking off for the last 20 years, really, ever since the decoding of the human genome. Another thing that's happening, of course, is that through the revolution in polygenic scores, polygenic research, we are able to now identify which groups are most likely to suffer from rapid decline in their 80s and so forth. What is your likelihood of developing Alzheimer's and so forth. So our polygenic scores will able to alert us to our likelihood of having a very awful senescence, last years of our lives, and give us a headway or a head start in terms of altering our standards of living so that we can have a better life when we are older. So there's a lot of things that is going on to arrest the problem of having miserable last few years of life. But final comment on that is that even though a lot of people have miserable lives when they are very old, very few people pull the plug. Even people who are very old, infirm, suffering all sorts of ailments, they try to hang on to life as long as possible. So I just don't buy the argument that because life becomes more difficult when you're old, it becomes worthless, because clearly people don't want to die even when they are in pain.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, oftentimes when you hear young people say, "Oh, I don't want to live to be so old," or whatever, my thought is, well, you're not there yet. So your point of view might change.
It will change. It will change.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are other things you care about more. Like maybe, you want seeing your grandkids graduate from high school or get married or something like that matters more to you than being physically agile. But so we had a couple of questions related specifically to news media. And I know you touched on that a little bit, but do you have any thoughts on the nature or the role that our news media plays in stoking pessimism and fear, and maybe even do you have thoughts on reforms or suggestions or anything that to make it better for consumers of news?
Well, the most commonsensical one, which was identified by Steven Pinker from Harvard, is that it would be good if, when people are reporting on trends, they include long-term trends. So, for example, both of the following statements are true. Deadly violence in the United States has skyrocketed in 2020 compared to 2019. That's a true statement. But it is also true that deadly violence and murder rate in the United States in 2020 was much lower than what it was in 1994 or 1990. So by including perhaps a trend, a graph saying, things have gotten worse last year, but in fact, compared to 20 or 30 years ago, we are still way ahead of the game, would be quite useful. And I don't know why they don't do it. It doesn't, it's just an extra sentence in an article. I mean, I know why they don't do it, which is that, terrible things sell. If it bleeds, it leads. And that, again, is tied directly to the way that we perceive the news. There have been done psychological studies where you get people in a room in front of a computer who are determined to look at the positive news. But in fact, if you measure how their eyes react to the news flashing on the screen, the eye immediately is drawn to the negative rather than the positive, because that's how we have evolved. I mean, we have evolved during a time when life was extremely difficult. Positivism, positive attitude was bad, in a sense that, okay, negative attitude was selected for. I mean, if you are walking by a bush and there's a rustle behind the bush and you think, well, I'm an optimist, nothing is going to happen, and there's a tiger behind it and it eats you, well, then you are immediately removed from the gene pool, right? So an underreaction to a threat is more costly than an overreaction to a threat, which is that you run away from the bush, even if there was nothing behind it. The overreaction is actually less costly from an evolutionary standpoint than underreaction to a threat. So we would have evolved to be more pessimistic, and therefore, so then you have websites like mine and many others that are just trying to promote the data for people to be able to see for themselves that things are not as bad, and hopefully share it with their friends so that they get a sense of reality. After all, I'm not selling snake oil. I'm not selling my own data. I'm not selling an optimistic view of the world. I'm just presenting data. It's a realistic view of the world. But if people want the reality, they have to also look for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know we're out of time, but I do think we have John. I'll ask John. I think we've got one more question from the in-person audience, if you don't mind, and then we'll close it out after that.
Yeah, so we have one student that would like to, I'm going to let the student ask the question himself, but he said
Sure.
Keep his mask on. So here he comes, just a sec.
Hello, Dr. Tupy. Talk really loud. Okay, so my question, I'm following your entire presentation. I really like the case you make for things being better than they used to be and pessimism being rampant. My question, is pessimism being unrealistically high actually a negative thing? I could see it from a personal standpoint. High pessimism leads to lower quality of life. I'd be unhappy. But from a global perspective, could that high pessimism possibly be driving us to improve faster?
Probably not, or rather, let me make a case of why not. You may well be right, but let me try to explain why not. The modern state of the world, the current state of the world, for all of its pluses and all of its minuses, is a product of certain economic and political institutions. The reason why we in the United States are not eating dirt, and why we don't have a government that murders tens of millions of people, is because we have liberal democracy and we have mixed economies, some form of free market capitalism that is heavily restricted, but still, in certain areas it is pretty free. If you believe, and more importantly, if many of your compadres and fellow voters believe that everything is going to hell, that America is a dystopian landscape, then what's the point of supporting the institutions that got us to this place? What's the point of voting for parties that support liberal democracy and free market capitalism? Why not go with people who believe the exact opposite? And who was it? Was it Rousseau or was it Marx who said, "What have the workers of the world have to lose?" Well, the reality is we have to lose a lot. Life in America is not perfect, but it is still a place where tens of millions of people are trying to get to, because it is pretty good compared to what it was. So we have a lot to lose by getting rid of the institutions which made the prosperity and relative tranquility possible in the first place. And if you are going to be optimistic, if you're going to be unduly pessimistic, and if it's all horrible, then a lot of your fellow voters and fellow citizens might decide that maybe we should try something else, maybe something along the lines of Chavez's Venezuela. And I would submit that that would be a terrible mistake.
Thank you. Well, we're a little bit over time, so thank you for giving us some extra time. And if everyone wants to, you won't be able to hear our applause. You'll hear mine maybe, but everyone wants to virtually give Marian a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us, and it was an uplifting presentation, and we definitely need that right now. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much, guys. All the best.
Thank you,
Good
Marian.
luck.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.